cases, laws were created in states that contradicted the Constitution. And we're going to see what happened or what were the results of these 3 cases. But we're going to start with Marbury versus Madison, and we're going to see how that Supreme Court case established the practice of judicial review. And this will help us to start looking at our lesson, or start answering our lesson question, which is how did early Supreme Court decisions expand the powers of the federal government? Let's get started with this first part, scholars.
If you're interested in constitutional law, you'll definitely want to know about Marbury versus Madison. It's one of the most important cases in Supreme Court history. Let's look at some background. William Marbury was appointed to be a federal judge by President John Adams. But this was right when Adams was leaving office and Thomas Jefferson was about to begin his first term as president. And Marbury didn't get the job he was promised. Why? Well, here's James Madison. He was President Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Jefferson told Madison not to follow through on Marbury's appointment. Madison basically said it doesn't matter that he was appointed by Adams. I'm not giving him the job. So that's the background. Let's take a closer look at the case. Now, a key piece of context for the Marbury versus Madison case is a law called the Judiciary Act of 1789. This law organized the federal court system that we have today. In this system, the Supreme Court is above the lower federal courts. The Judiciary Act also gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction over more types of cases than the Constitution had. So it expanded the powers of the court. Original jurisdiction means the Supreme Court can hear a case first. The case doesn't have to go through a lower federal court and then be appealed to the Supreme Court. Now, back to Marbury versus Madison. Remember that Marbury was refused his appointment as a judge? So he argued to the Supreme Court that Madison should be required to give him that appointment. He said, I was appointed, I want that job, Madison needs to give it to me. Marbury also argued that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction over the case. And one part of this original jurisdiction is that they could issue what's called a writ of mandamus, which is basically a way of ordering Madison to fill the appointment. Okay, those are the facts of the case. Marbury versus Madison turned out to be really important, and it ended up having a big impact on the role of the Supreme Court in the United States. So, what decision do you think the Supreme Court made?
What was the decision? Drumroll, please. The decision of Marbury versus Madison was this: that the Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. So that was the first thing. As part of it, they ruled and they said that the court did not have original jurisdiction in the Marbury case. Because they didn't have original jurisdiction, or for it to go directly to the Supreme Court, it was ruled that the Supreme Court could not hear the Marbury court case, and it ruled against Marbury. And what this did is that this act, it gave powers to the Supreme Court that went beyond the Constitution's limits. What we mean by that is that it established the premise of judicial review. Now, judicial review is extremely important. What it says is this: the judicial review, it's the power to determine if an act is constitutional, and that falls upon the Supreme Court, or the judicial branch. This is text actually from the ruling in Marbury versus Madison, which took place in 1803. It says, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And this is related, what the law say what the law is back to judicial review. Now, this was really important, this concept of judicial review. Even though it started with an appointed judge and a Secretary of State, it would have long-reaching and far-reaching implications because it gave the judicial branch a check on the legislative branch and the executive branch, where if the executive branch does something that is deemed unconstitutional, the judicial branch can say, no, you can't do that, Mr. or Madam President. If Congress passes a law that is unconstitutional, the judicial branch can say, no, Congress, you can't do it, that is an unconstitutional law. So the big takeaway here is that judicial review further established the the checks and balances between our government and made the power of the judicial branch more. Scholars, finish the first part of the lesson, on to the second part. Before we move on to the second part, you look at that lesson question. It's at the top of the screen. It says, how did early Supreme Court decisions expand the powers of the federal government? Well, recall, in the first part, we looked at Marbury versus Madison, how that established the idea of judicial review, which said that the judicial branch of government has the power to rule a law constitutional, also an act constitutional or unconstitutional. And that expanded the power of the judicial branch in the federal government. Now, in the second part, scholars, we're going to look at McCulloch versus Maryland. And the two things that came out of this were, one, implied powers, and two, is federal supremacy. So let's go ahead and get started with this second part. Two parties in this court case were James McCulloch and the state of Maryland. But first, got to start with the facts. Here are the facts. The first fact, that's really important, is this one: that James McCulloch, he ran a federal bank in the state of Maryland. So it was a federal bank, which is higher than the other state banks. The second key fact is that Maryland passed a law that required the federal bank to pay state taxes. So those are the facts. Can a federal bank, or should a federal bank be required to pay state taxes? So here, moving on to the arguments. Arguments on James McCulloch's side. What he did is this: one, he argued that Congress had the constitutional authority to create a bank. The Constitution gives us the authority, the federal government, to create a bank. And because it is a federal bank, the second thing he argued is that the state cannot tax a federal bank because the federal government is higher than the state governments. However, the state of Maryland, they argued the opposite. What they argued is that the Constitution does not give Congress the authority to create banks. So those are the two main arguments, and we're going to check out the decision coming up soon.
Meow. Oh shit, Talkie. Wash your things.
which side were you on? Were you on McCullough's side or were you on Maryland's side? Well, hopefully you're on McCullough's side, because McCullough's side actually won the argument, and the impact of this was the creation of implied powers. Now, the court, like we just said, established the principle of implied powers, and what that comes from is this right here, is that powers that are necessary and proper for Congress to carry out its duties. Now, these implied powers, the second key thing, is that the implied powers are not specifically listed in the Constitution. What I mean by that is this. If you read the Constitution, it will not specifically say the Congress can create X. It doesn't say it. However, it does say that the Congress can regulate interstate trade. It can coin money. And because it can coin money and because it can regulate some trade, and it is necessary and proper for the Congress to create a bank to help facilitate that trade and help hold that money. So that's what we're talking about in terms of implied powers. But it also established federal supremacy. And it ruled on the principle of federal supremacy, meaning that the federal government and federal laws and the federal banks are above the state-run institutions. So what it means is this. One, is that the states, they cannot interfere with federal government activities. They can't do it because the federal government is superior. The second thing it ruled on is that the federal government has powers that go beyond the state powers. So again, the key thing here is that McCullough versus Maryland, first it outlined the implied powers, the necessary and proper clause, but it also laid out that the federal government is supreme above the various state governments.
Oh yeah.
Hey, look at that, scholars. You finished the first two parts. Only one more left. Stay with me. You're doing great. I'm proud of you. Before we move on to the third part, take a look at that lesson question. It's at the top of the screen. It says, how did early Supreme Court decisions expand the powers of the federal government? Well, in order to start answering that question, let's review it. The first part, we looked at Marbury versus Maryland, and we saw how the process of judicial review expanded the judicial branch's powers, and the judicial branch is part of the federal government. In the second part, we looked at McCullough versus Maryland, which further talked about the implied powers, and it also laid out the supremacy clause, meaning that the federal government is supreme over the different state governments. And the third part, we're going to look at Gibbons versus Ogden, and again, how this established federal supremacy. And by looking at this third part, we're really going to be able to answer the lesson question, which showed how Supreme Court decisions expanded the powers of the federal government. Let's get started with this last part, scholars. Gibbons versus Ogden, it focused on the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. Well, we can't talk about the Commerce Clause without first checking out exactly what it says. Let's look at it together. It says, Congress shall have power to regulate or control commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Now, notice, it does not say, or it does not define what commerce is. Is that just the exchanging of money, or could it be the exchanging of licenses, could it be the exchanging of something else? It doesn't define it. So this is the first time the Supreme Court is going to rule on the Commerce Clause and define what commerce is. So, first things first, the facts. Here are the facts. 1. Thomas Gibbons, he had a federal license to operate his steamboat company on the river. You can see an example of a steamboat right here. Now, fact number 2. Aaron Ogden had a state license to operate his steamboat company. But notice he had a state license. And Ogden, he sued Gibbons. Now, Ogden, this man right here, had a monopoly along the river, meaning he controlled all the ships and he controlled all the passages that went along this river. So he saw Gibbons as trying to encroach on his monopoly, on his turf, and take away his side of the money. So because of that, Ogden sued Gibbons. Now, to the arguments. Let's see which side you're on. First, Thomas Gibbons. He claimed that federal licenses gave him the right to operate his business along this river. He also argued that the Constitution gave the federal government power over interstate commerce. That is commerce between states. So if New Hampshire is trading with Vermont, that can be regulated because it's between states. So that's what Thomas Gibbons argued for. So, if you like that, make sure you stick with him. Aaron Ogden argued against this idea of federal supremacy. He claimed this. 1. He claimed that Gibbons should not be allowed to operate in New York waters. 2. He argued that both federal and New York shared power over interstate commerce. So you can see the differences. He's saying shared over here with Ogden, but Gibbons is saying the federal government is supreme over interstate commerce. And those are the cases, those are the arguments. So figure out which side you're on, and I'll tell you about the decision next.
Yay!
Alright, I've just received from the Supreme Court that they have ruled in favor of Gibbons. If you were on Gibbons' side, if you agree with his argument, well, wonderful work. So this was the court's decision. Like we just said, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Gibbons. Now what they said in addition to that, they said that because of the Commerce Clause, this gives Congress powers to regulate interstate business. Because it's written in the Commerce Clause, it gives Congress the ability to regulate that trade. And this further led to greater federal supremacy, and the case expanded that idea as well. It said, 1, that Congress can regulate trade between states. That's critical. Not in a state. If Virginia is trading, one city in Virginia is trading with another city in Virginia, that's Virginia's business. But the minute that trade from Virginia goes to Ohio or goes to West Virginia, for example, Congress can regulate that. Second thing it said is that the federal law is superior to state law. So you can see again how these early cases established the supremacy of the federal government.
Yay!